I think it's really interesting to see just how much did the Kennedys know. There are two CIA agents who directly testified that from the outset, JFK wanted a mechanism to get rid of foreign leaders like Castro. JFK was a very smart man. He was a man who had witnessed World War II right up. He had a front row to it. He was there with Winston Churchill giving speeches in London when London was being bombed. His oldest brother, had lost his life fighting against Hitler. So the idea that maybe we would have another Hitler type of situation, or a person that was willing to put a nuclear weapons 90 miles from the United States, and the fact that Castro is willing to do that, there was no doubt in Kennedy's mind that we had to get rid of Castro.
What's up, guys? This time I sit down with Thomas Maier. He is an award-winning author, investigative journalist, and television producer. His book, Masters of Sex, was the basis for the Emmy-winning Showtime drama that ran for 4 seasons. His most recent book, which we'll be getting into today, is called Mafia Spies, the inside story of the CIA, Gangsters, JFK, and Castro, which tells the true story of gangsters Gianni Roselli and Sam Giancana, who were hired by the CIA to kill Fidel Castro, only to wind up murdered themselves amidst a whirlwind of congressional hearings and a national debate on the JFK assassination. Mafia Spies was also turned into a docuseries of the same name, which can now be streamed on Paramount Plus and Showtime. On this episode, Thomas Maier and I get into who really were the men Sam Giancana and Gianni Roselli, and how did they get involved with the CIA? What exactly was the plot to take out Fidel Castro? How did Castro consistently evade assassination attempts in the face of the CIA's clandestine efforts? How did a love triangle between President John F. Kennedy, Sam Giancana, and a Hollywood starlet become part of a CIA plot? Was the JFK assassination in any way connected to the CIA's plot to assassinate Castro? We get into all of that and more on this episode. If you'd like to support the AUXORO Podcast, please subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. This is such a huge help for getting the word out about the show, because when we have more ratings on Spotify and more subscribers on YouTube, people engaging, then the Overlord algorithm says, hey, people are enjoying this show. We're going to push it out to more people, and then they get recommended the podcast. So rate the show, subscribe, share it with a friend. You can also join AUXORO Premium for $5 a month, where you get bonus episodes, subscriber-only AMAs, mini-sodes, the ability to become part of the show, and more. And that's at auxoro.supercast.com. Thank you for however you choose to support. And without further ado, please enjoy this deep diving, wide-ranging episode with Thomas Maier. Thomas Maier, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Zach.
Of course. So we were chatting literally right before I started recording, and you mentioned the Mafia Spies show, and I just finished going through the book, so I have not had time to check out the show yet. And I wanted to get your opinion on what is it like seeing the book that you've written, that you spent years researching and writing, come to life on the big screen and on, people's televisions. Like, what does that feel like to see? Because I know you've had some series in the past with Masters of Sex, but like, what does this most recently feel like with Mafia Spies?
Well, it was a lot more fun. As you mentioned, I had a book. It was a biography of Masters and Johnson, the sex researchers, and that became a drama on Showtime. And that was on for 4 seasons. And that was kind of like what was often called the golden age of cable television. There were shows like Breaking Bad and Mad Men were on, and Masters of Sex was part of that era there. It ended in 2016, and that's when we signed, initially, I signed a contract to do what became Mafia Spies. What happened was, in 2016, I was out in Los Angeles with my wife, and I was invited to go to lunch with the head of Warner Brothers, a fellow named Peter Roth. And he asked me about what I was going to do next. And I said, well, I'm starting a book. I'm doing a book about two gangsters hired by the CIA who are hired to assassinate Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba, and yet they never quite get him, and they wind up dead themselves. And so he said, well, that sounds great. Let's try and do it. So I said, well, I haven't written the book yet. And so I said, don't worry about it. We'll put it into the contract. And so we went around and we tried to pitch the show. And we didn't get anywhere because I hadn't written the book. So the book came out in 2019. The book is Mafia Spies, the experience was a lot different than Masters of Sex in the sense that it became a docu-series. And so I was not only a producer as I was with Masters of Sex, but I was also involved in it. I'm one of the narrators and one of the commentators on air as well as being a producer for Mafia Spies. So it was a lot of fun, to answer your question in a very simple way.
Do you get a lot of control over the arc of Mafia Spies, the show, versus the arc of Mafia Spies, the book? Like how things map out, how the series comes together? Because obviously when you try to put 400 to 500 pages to screen, you're going to have to cut things out. You're going to have to make big decisions. How much control do you have over that for the show that's based on your book?
Well, basically, the short answer is I'm not. I'm really more in the consulting phase. That it was done by two showrunners that were Tom Donahue and Ilan Arboleda, and they were hired by another executive producer named Danny Strong. And Danny actually intended it to be a drama. They had difficulties getting that off the ground, especially during the COVID era. And so the decision was made to make it into a docu-series. So that experience was very different. And yet I was somewhat familiar with the process. I went to Columbia Journalism School and I won the documentary prize at graduation. And I sold a documentary to Channel 13. And I had also done a lot of television work in the last 10 years for Newsday, the newspaper where I worked for 40 years. And about 2 or 3 years ago, I won a New York Emmy for a documentary I did about a man who had been falsely accused of murder.
Mm-hmm. So the book Mafia Spies, there are so many moving parts, so many characters, and you really get a feel for how much information is in the book when you get to the footnotes on Kindle at the end of the book, where you're like, holy shit, 30% of the pages on Kindle are just the references for the things in the story. How did you initially zero in on the story Mafia Spies? Like, what was the thing that drew you in to the arc of this story?
Well, I had done a previous 2 books involving the Kennedys, and in doing so, I became aware of a gangster by the name of Sam Giancana. He was the head of the mob in Chicago, and actually, I began my career in Chicago as a reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times. And so I was aware of Giancana, and I was thinking of doing a book just about him. But then when I became aware of the other gangster, Johnny Roselli was a gangster who started in Chicago, but they sent him out to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, and he became the mob's guy out in Hollywood, involved with a lot of the studio heads. He dated a lot of starlets and well-known actresses like Lana Turner, Donna Reed. So I thought the relationship between the buddy friendship, if you will, between these two gangsters, two very different men, would be a really interesting way of doing a compare and contrast, kind of like that old English assignment in high school, compare and contrast. And so they really played off of one another. And Sam Giancana was a guy who fundamentally was kind of like a Tony Soprano type. He had a wife and 3 daughters, and his wife dropped dead, and then suddenly he was at sea. He was kind of like lost without his beloved. Angeline was his wife's name. And so he starts hanging out more and more with Gianni Roselli, both in Los Angeles, but particularly in Las Vegas, where the mob has a number of casinos. And Gianni, he's kind of a Casanova type. It's really in Las Vegas and in Havana, Cuba, where the mob also, this is in the 50s, where the mob also has controls a number of casinos, where the two buddies, if you will, Sam and Johnny, interact quite a bit. And it's at that point in which Johnny is recruited and gets Sam involved in the plot by the CIA to get rid of Castro.
It's funny because as I'm reading the book, I found myself becoming nostalgic about a time that I never even lived through. I'm just like thinking about all these celebrities, politicians, mobsters, they're all hanging out together in public spaces, which would never happen today because of cell phones and social media. It's just the culture is just completely different. But to be able to walk through...
People would drink all the time, and there's smoke all around the place, It's pretty funny.
Do you find yourself getting nostalgic at all, or like romanticizing the time period as you're writing? Because as I'm reading it, I can't help but wonder what it would be like to, sit at a table with Frank Sinatra, and there's no phones, no cameras, like nothing's going to be in the paper about it the next day. People just didn't have to worry about that stuff back then.
Yeah, it's a great time period. And as a writer, there was a lot of material. In fact, there was a lot of documents that I got that were released about 5 years ago. They were related to the JFK assassination, and they had been kept confidential for more than 50 years.
This was the big, 50,000 plus release.
Right, a big document dump. But in those documents, there was nothing really that indicated, certainly with any certainty, that anybody beyond Lee Harvey Oswald was involved with the JFK assassination. But what the Warren Commission, the commission that investigated JFK's death, one of the things that they were kept from was the information about the CIA's plot to kill Castro. And Castro, leading up to JFK's death, had publicly said, he had said in a number of interviews, "I know you're trying to kill me," because there had already been a number of attempts. He says, "I know you're trying to kill me, and two can play that game." And so that was not all that information really was not reviewed by the Warren Commission. Why was that? Because the person who launched that CIA plot, a guy named Alan Dulles, who had been the head of the CIA, he was named at the suggestion of Bobby Kennedy to the Warren Commission. And Bobby Kennedy had also been very involved in this whole plot to get rid of Castro. So these documents that became available five years ago, they had a lot of granular detail, particularly about the fact that the CIA was running a war, an undeclared war, out of southern Florida. They were training a number of Cuban exiles. In fact, Gianni Roselli and Giancana were part of that. And there are some really interesting examples in which, for instance, Gianni Roselli would jump in a boat with a group of exiles and go to Cuba in the attempts to kill Castro, and how that was thwarted. And that's all described in my book. But it's also reenacted in the show that's on Paramount and Showtime as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned the CIA hatches this plan to kill Castro, and they tap the two gangsters, Sam Giancana and Gianni Roselli, who it feels like they're the two major characters that the book is told through the eyes of. Like everything's kind of moving around them, and then it comes back to them at the end with the Senate testimony and like everything that happens that we'll get into. But like I'm just wondering the motivations on both sides, where you have the CIA, who's a government agency, and they turn to the mafia to get the job done of an assassination plot of a major political figure that the U.S. government is trying to take out. What drives the motivations on both sides with the CIA turning to two mobsters? And then why would Roselli and Giancana want to engage in a CIA assassination plot who, are mob through and through? They're incredibly rich already, notoriously hate feds and spooks. Like what drives the motivations on both sides?
Well, a couple things. One is, as far as the mafia was concerned, bear in mind, in the late 50s, most Americans during the winter months, particularly if you lived in a place like New York or Chicago, most of those folks would go down to Havana rather than Las Vegas. Las Vegas was just getting off the ground after World War II. It really began after World War II, whereas Havana had already been established since the 1920s and 30s as this winter haven for people to go down. And that phrase, what goes on in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas. Well, that was even more so in Havana. And so the mob made tons of money in Havana. And Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana, they would often be down in Havana, particularly during the winter months, overseeing the casinos. So they lost tons of money. So when Fidel Castro took power, he threw out all of the U.S. businesses, including the casino owners. And so they were furious about that. They had lost tons of money. The government, the American government, had a different motivation. Their motivation was the fact that during the Cold War, there were two things that particularly happened in the late 50s. One was the Russians somehow figured out how to send a rocket into space. They were the first ones into space. That was really a startling surprise for the government, and particularly when they thought that maybe the Russians might be able to put a nuclear missile on top of that rocket. And so that was very threatening. But the other thing that happened is when Castro took power in Cuba, only 90 miles away from the United States, he relatively quickly allied himself with the Soviet Union, partly because of the way we mishandled things with Castro. But fundamentally, Castro grew up, and his whole revolution really was a way of rejecting the U.S. involvement in Cuba. And so by aligning himself with the Soviet Union, he was willing to allow the Soviets to put missiles into Cuba. And that really prompted probably the closest we've ever come to World War III, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. So that whole era, the motivation of the government to get rid of Castro and the motivation of the mob came together. And when the decision was made in the late stages of the Eisenhower administration, in other words, in late 59 and early 1960. In 1960, bear in mind, Eisenhower's still the president. The decision is made to saw off Castro, to get rid of him. And so they recruit through an intermediary, the two gangsters, Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana.
Yeah. So when the CIA was deciding who was ultimately going to become the hitmen to take out Castro, I'm just wondering, because you see so many assassinations are that sniper style guys waiting for a long time for someone to come out of their house, or, a public event like we just saw with Trump. And that's typically how things have moved forward in the assassination realm. And we did have some snipers coming back from World War II in America. Was there ever any sort of operation or consideration to involve the military or retired military guys to just go in and take out Castro, or was it was always the mafia from the beginning?
No, in fact, it's funny because there was an attempt there was a plan to kill Castro early on when he visited New York, and they wanted to put an exploding cigar into somewhere in the possession of Castro. and they tried to recruit the New York City Police Department. I tell this story in my book, and that when the New York City cops find out about this, they say, no way, we're not going to be involved in assassination. There were a number of different attempts to kill Castro. It was almost like whack-a-mole, that game where you keep on trying to, you have the mallet and you keep on trying to kill. And why and how Castro evaded assassination is really fascinating. We talked about those documents before. Those documents really show that Castro had developed a number of informants and double agents in Florida. And so he was able to find out what was going on with the CIA and the plots to kill him. And so it was really quite an amazing story about how he evaded assassination. Bear in mind, this book, Mafia Spies, is about our first foray, the United States, first foray into the assassination business. Prior to this, spying was essentially it was more of a passive thing. It was overseeing things. It was keeping tabs on the economics or the political situation. But we didn't get directly involved in a government, and we didn't try to certainly not kill a foreign leader until this particular case. And this really marks a major change in our approach to things. And I think there were a lot of lessons that results from this whole case that's described in Mafia Spies that we're still living with today. In other words, should we use drones to kill foreign leaders or other political opponents, which we are? What are the ground rules and such? Generally speaking, we leave that up to the President of the United States. And what's interesting is that the Supreme Court recently, just about a month or so ago, had a big decision about presidential immunity. And in fact, it was Justice Clarence Thomas who brought up Operation Mongoose, which is the name of the operation that we're talking about here in Mafia Spies. He talked about this circumstance. And would it be all right for a president to authorize the assassination of somebody? And the decision by the court certainly leaves that open more than ever. They basically make it pretty undefined as to what's legal and illegal. Ironically, when you look at Mafia Spies, they're all concerned that they're going to get in trouble with this most recent Supreme Court decision. They may not have gotten in trouble for trying to kill somebody.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Should the president be allowed to authorize the assassination of other world leaders? And if the answer is yes for the United States, then that also opens us up for other countries going, okay, your president's giving the green light to take out political leaders in Africa, Middle East, South America, wherever. You can't react. You can't be surprised if other people are going to try to take out the president of the United States if he's authorizing all of these operations overseas. It almost reminds me of like a much smaller scale version of nuclear weapons, where it's like we have nuclear weapons and so do all these other countries. And if one person uses them, then like the entire thing's just going to become a shitstorm, and the globe is going to go up in flames. And if the president authorizes an assassination of a leader that a huge part of the world deems unethical or unnecessary, then that opens the window into retaliatory assassinations.
Oh, very definitely. When this all started to come out, it happened around 1960, but it took almost 15 years for it to come out. And there were a number of Senate hearings and House hearings. Particularly, there was a Senate panel that looked at this. And when it came out that all of this material about the attempts to kill Castro, the secret plan by the CIA, when it came out, one of the people that had been on the Warren Commission back in 1964 was a congressman by the name of Gerald Ford. But by the mid-1970s, when all this became public, Gerald Ford had become the president of the United States. And he issued an order saying that we would not get involved in any type any type of assassination plots. He firmly made a prohibition on that. However, the war on terror has kind of made that a blurry once again. Is it appropriate to use drones, for instance? And what are the circumstances? What are the guidelines? What are the limitations? And again, the Supreme Court decision opens that up even more so. Bear in mind, the people back in 1960s, people like Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA and who had been on the Warren Commission, he had made his bones, if you will, to use a mob phrase. He had made his bones during World War II. He was a terrific spy. He was based in Switzerland. And a lot of people that came out of World War II said they were of the mind of, well, if we had assassinated Adolf Hitler, how many thousands, millions of people could we have saved if early on we had tried to assassinate Hitler? So in that context, and given the nuclear confrontation and the wild card nature of Fidel Castro, it was really in that context that a lot of people decided to participate in this secret plot to kill Castro.
Yeah, absolutely. So you had mentioned that the archetypes of Roselli and Giancana were very different.
Yeah.
Are there any favorite stories that come to mind when you think of how their personalities interacted, or just the interaction of Roselli and Giancana embarking on this CIA assassination plot to kill Castro together? Does anything pop up in your mind where you go, like, this is a perfect meeting point of their personalities based on what happened and how things turned out in a specific situation?
Oh, yeah. There's a number of cases like that. But, with Sam Giancana, he was a guy who had 3 teenage daughters. In fact, the oldest daughter is now 88 years old, and she's in Mafia Spies, excuse me, the TV show, and she's terrific. She's hilarious, actually, in talking about. She was a real hellraiser as a teenager. So what happened with Sam Giancana's wife? She and the 3 daughters went down to Florida, and she was screaming at her daughter, Antoinette Giancana, the oldest daughter, when Giancana's wife dropped dead, screaming at the kids. And he was really lost. He was one of those guys that looked at life or looked at women either as, I guess the phrase psychologically is the Madonna whore. That in other words, you were either a woman, my wife, who I put up on a pedestal and I adore, or I have some girlfriend on the side or whatever. But that's how he kind of viewed the world. Whereas Johnny Roselli was, for about 5 minutes he was married, but fundamentally he was a Casanova guy who really liked women, and women really liked him. He was known as Handsome Johnny. So, if this was a movie, I could see somebody like Leonardo DiCaprio, somebody like that playing Johnny Roselli. Roselli, as I said, was very smooth, and the thing where it's most complicated with the two, there's a number of things that they do together, but Johnny lives in Los Angeles, and he meets a young woman by the name of Judy Campbell, who becomes kind of like a Monica Lewinsky in this story. Monica Lewinsky, who was involved in the Clinton sex scandals and such. A young woman who gets involved in some pretty with very powerful men, and it gets involved in deep waters, much darker and deeper than she ever imagined, I think, and certainly with Lewinsky, and I think that was the case with Judy Campbell. So she's introduced to Johnny Roselli, and Roselli eventually introduces her to Frank Sinatra. And Sinatra dates her or whatever for a while, and then during the 1960 campaign in Las Vegas, Sinatra introduces Judy Campbell to John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy is running for president. It's amazing that this set of circumstances, but it is absolutely all true. And John Kennedy begins an affair with Judy Campbell that continues for almost 2 years, all the way into the White House. In fact, one of the things that I cite is that there's something like 60 or 70 different logged telephone calls between Campbell and the White House. And when later on, what happens is that Judy Campbell begins to be courted by Sam Giancana, and I think they were aware that they were well aware that she was having an affair with the President of the United States, so that if Giancana was also courting Judy Campbell, it would create a great compromise. The Russians call it kompromat, but it's sexual compromise. So then, in other words, they had something on the President of the United States, and that's what Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana, by helping out the CIA, they were hoping to get a get-out-of-jail-free card. In other words, they would get the FBI, the other arm of the government, off of their backs as mobsters. And by also having this compromising situation involving Judy Campbell and the knowledge of that, and the fact eventually the FBI finds out about it, they thought that was also another insurance policy. So there were a lot of complications between Johnny and Sam, but I was really fascinated by the compare and contrast between the two men, but also their world, the world of people like Frank Sinatra. I was really fascinated how much Sinatra was a fanboy of Sam Giancana. In fact, they traded friendship rings, and Sinatra always wanted to be like a tough guy, and Giancana at times kind of like push back and just say, keep that guy away from me. He has too much of a big mouth and whatever. But when I look at Sinatra, and I think Sinatra's one of the great musical artists of the 20th century. He's just a tremendous singer. And whose influence, even in things like rap, where Gangsters, when they think of Gangsters, it goes back to the Rat Pack of the Sinatra, the Las Vegas crowd, all that type of thing. When I look at Sinatra's career, it was a lot of fun because, when he began in the 40s, he was kind of this sweet, melodious, very thin singer with a big bow tie, but he had a problem with his voice, and for a while nobody would hire Frank Sinatra. This is in the early 50s. The only people that would hire him, that remained loyal to him, were people that he knew from the very outset who were involved with the mob. And they kept him, and he was very loyal to Giancana for reasons like that. But it's interesting how Giancana's influence seemed to have an influence on Sinatra's kind of presentation of himself. This kind of gangster, rat packy. He goes from like this sweet, melodious guy with the bow tie to kind of a brassy, very aggressive even singer. And so it's very fascinating. They even dress the same. They wear the same hats. And in fact, it's funny because if you look at it, and I do toy with this a little bit in my book, if you look at Johnny Roselli, there's a little bit like a Dean Martin there, and Sam is a little bit like Frank, or actually, it's almost like they were mirror versions of each other. And actually, Johnny Roselli thought of himself as a movie producer. He wanted to produce a movie with Sinatra and such. I discussed that in my book. So it's really interesting, the interaction between the gangsters and these two very famous entertainers.
Yeah, I think even in the book you mentioned Sinatra they called it a hoodlum complex, where he really just loved the streets, or he wanted to be seen as a guy that was of the streets and was a singer, doing these very elegant performances, but then he was involved with the whole mafia underworld and he just wasn't able to stay away from it.
Yeah, no, he really wasn't. In fact, he testified later on that he had no involvement, but he actually was a secret. Giancana was a secret owner of a resort that Sinatra ran in Nevada for a time period. And he actually lost the license there for a while, gave it up because of the exposure of Giancana in his business affairs. So, despite his protestations, the FBI files on Sinatra and Giancana, they are numerous about their interactions with one another.
So I wanted to get into some of the specific assassination attempts, and I think that one attempt that seems like it was literally straight out of a movie, like this was written for a James Bond film, who Alan Dulles was a huge fan of. He's a huge fan of Ian Fleming and the James Bond books that you talk about in Mafia Spies. But this, to me, felt like the most James Bondian assassination attempt was the Martina Lorenz attempt. And I wanted to see if you could tell the story of what happened with, not Martina, sorry, was it Marita Lorenz?
Yes, that's correct.
Marita Lorenz. Can you tell the story of Marita Lorenz's attempted assassination attempt, which is a unnecessary attempt word at the end, but her attempted assassination and how that ended up?
Well, Marita Lorenz was a young woman whose family was fairly affluent, or they enough so that they had a boat that they parked in Havana, and they came to Castro's attention, and he came on the boat and he met Marita, and then Marita's family went to New York, and but they had an affair, Marita and Fidel Castro. And she was ultimately recruited by the CIA to come back to Havana as if she had missed Fidel or whatever. And they eventually wind up in a hotel room. And the CIA had put 2 poison pellets into a jar of cold cream that she carried back with her to Havana. And so when Fidel and Marita got back into a bedroom in Havana, she goes into the bathroom to take out the 2 poison pellets and somehow slip them into, the plan, I guess, was to slip it into Fidel's food or his drink or whatever. And those pellets actually had disintegrated. They had dissolved because of the moisture of the cold cream. And so when she comes back into the bedroom, Castro's got one of his guns on a table. And essentially, just by the way she's acting, he says, "You came here to kill me, didn't you?" And she kind of stalls or whatever. And he says, "Well, here, go ahead if you want to kill me." And he points to the gun. And according to Marita, it's at that point where she breaks down and falls into the arms of Fidel Castro, and they make love instead of killing him. She winds up making love to him, and that was probably the most interesting, one of many interesting examples of the attempts to kill Castro. There were also things, as I mentioned, exploding cigars, a number of attempts to poison them. That was the preferred method of the 2 gangsters, rather than have some Tommy guns. But there were also attempts with things like bazookas and long distance sniping and such. But nothing ever got to Castro. It's really quite an amazing story.
Yeah, I just wanted to read an excerpt from Mafia Spies on the Lorenz attempt.
Sure, please do.
It's as you described, because I just want people to get, a really good feel for this moment. Sure. And you write, "Did you come here to kill me?" Castro asked. Marita stood near the bed, not in it. "Yes, I wanted to see you," she replied. "Do you work for the CIA?" he prodded further. "Not really," she said. "I work for myself." According to Lorenz, the tired Cuban leader rolled over, pulled out his .45 caliber revolver, and gave it to her. If she wanted to kill him, now was her chance. Thoroughly disarmed by their exchange, Lorenz instead opened the chamber and removed the bullets. He didn't flinch, Lorenz later recalled. He was so sure of me, we made love. So Castro, like you said, gave a gun to the person trying to murder him and ended up having sex with her. And I know I shouldn't have any likability towards Castro, but it's hard not to like the guy a little bit after that story. Like, he literally screwed his way out of death.
Yeah, it really is an amazing story. For a lot of the Cubans, particularly those who were poor, who identified with the revolution of Castro, that he was a romanticized, idolized figure. But for a lot of people who were forced to leave their homeland, and in the eye of history, when we look at Fidel Castro, he was very much a bloody dictator who enforced really an oppressive dictatorship for the rest of his regime. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes romanticized even in this country. But I did go back to Cuba. I went to Cuba as part of the research for this book, and it's really a land that's beautiful, and there's so much to Cuba, but it's a land that's stuck in as if it's still in the 1950s, and there's still as many poor people as there was before. So it's very unfortunate about what happened to Cuba under the Castro regime, but as you said, a big part of his appeal was the kind of the courage that he showed in trying to create a revolution and trying to, they asked him about his sports and playing sports, and he said that something to the effect that avoiding assassination was the biggest occupation that he had.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to go to Cuba back in 2015, and this was actually for a college baseball trip. We played 5 or 6 different teams across multiple provinces in Cuba, and we had some time to explore. We went into Havana, and you're right, it does feel like this place trapped in time, with the buildings, with the cars, with the streets, just, everything kind of looks like what I would picture in my mind of the 1950s, or what I've seen in movies, photographs, since I wasn't alive during then. But it does feel like this frozen in time moment. And I noticed the two things, or the two types of buildings that looked like they had the most money put into them, were the government buildings and the baseball facilities, because Cuba's baseball team, they don't fuck around. Like they Castro was known for actively keeping security on his Cuban baseball national team. Even when they were traveling to South America and Mexico, they'd have security guards outside the baseball players' rooms just in case they tried to flee. And the guys that did make it to Florida or just managed to cross the coast into the U.S. somewhere often got signed to multi-million-dollar MLB contracts. And to me, I was just like, wow, they won't pour money into their average citizen, but they'll build a really nice baseball stadium. They'll put millions of dollars into building the Cuban national team.
Well, there's also a lot of money that he stashed away in foreign offshore banks and such, and that's coming out in recent years as well. So, it's Mafia Spies is really in a 20-year period from about 1960 through the mid 1970s, but it is. I think there are a lot of lessons for us to draw from that experience for today.
Do you have a favorite or a most intriguing assassination attempt on Castro that often gets overlooked? Maybe something that people don't talk about as much because it's not as flashy, but like it was still a very, in your eyes, a storied attempt, a colorful attempt.
Oh, sure. Well, my favorite in many ways is Gianni Roselli, who became very gung-ho in this whole effort to try to train the Cuban exiles as an army or as a group of spies to go over to Cuba and to try to get rid of Castro. And there's one particular moment in the book in which Johnny goes over in a couple of boats, but he's in one particular boat, and it's in the middle of the night. And so you could imagine the 90 miles between Florida and Cuba. It's a long ride, needless to say, in the middle of the night, very, very dark. And they're going to a particular spot where they're supposed to meet other spies, other people who are supporting the CIA's effort, who are already in Cuba. And when they get there, instead, the lights go on, and it's Castro's security forces that they're in boats, and when they start chasing Johnny and the people that he's with, and they start firing at the boats, and Johnny's boat actually takes on water, and he has to jump out and jump into another boat where they flee and they go back to Florida. But that kind of illustrated to me just the sheer daringness of this whole episode, the level of commitment by Gianni Roselli, particularly involved in this. He really wanted to show that he was a patriot. In fact, he had been offered more than $100,000 by the CIA to kill Castro, and he said, "No, we don't need that." The mob was more than happy to try to kill Castro in this way with the blessings of the government here. But he saw himself as a patriot, and so to the extent that he's out there jumping into boats and then being fired upon, that to me was an extraordinary story.
The crew that Roselli went down to Cuba with at one time, were those the mercenaries that the CIA was helping to train in South Florida, or where were they getting the crews from to help out Johnny and Giancana?
Well, most of them were Cuban exiles, people who either opposed Castro politically as communism, political reasons, or they were part of the previous government, or they had been landowners, or they had just been middle class people who had been forced out of Castro. They lost their livelihoods, and they were down in Florida, and they really wanted, for their own patriotic reasons, to recover and reclaim Cuba in their eyes. And so most of those folks were Cubans, and they were trained by the CIA. There were some mercenaries and whatever, but fundamentally, they were Cuban exiles who were determined to reclaim their homeland.
And South Florida was the training base for the most part.
Yeah, that was really what's amazing to me, is that we had all these, literally at one point there was thousands of people involved in all this. There were businesses that were set up as fronts in Florida with phony names, just to guard the fact that they were running a big training center in the South Florida area, and yet the average American in other parts of the United States, we had no idea that there was such a war going on, and that it was that really the home base for it was South Florida.
Yeah, it's even more amazing when you think about it, because when I picture a military base and a place where the military or a government organization is running a secret operation and training people to do that, I think of something just in the middle of nowhere, or some place where you get shot if you walk up to that's gated in the desert, and then the actual base is like 30 miles beyond the fence. Like the fence is just like the beginning, and the fact that they were
Zach, also, one of my sons lives in Miami. It's a very different world now than it was in the 50s. And they weren't training on Miami Beach. They were training, in more the swampy areas.
Okay, gotcha.
And also in the Keys, in that area, which was actually when you drive from Miami into the Florida Keys, you usually turn to the right and you're going south along the Keys. But actually there was a place that actually I eyeballed this when I went down there. Instead of going to the right down the Keys, there's a little bit of land that goes to the north on the Keys. And in that area is one of the places that they launched a lot of these boats. And that's one of the places that I checked out as part of my research.
Okay, that makes sense. So it was much less developed back then.
Yeah,
the Keys were not the
really
Keys of today.
But still, the fact that we were doing this, and it did come to the attention, whenever it did come to the attention of either the local police or at one point the local newspaper, the CIA said, "Oh no, you can't say anything. It's top secret. Blah blah blah." And so this is a different time, different era. The newspaper in particular said, "Okay, we won't report about this." There was an accident that happened or an incident that happened, and they didn't report it deliberately because the CIA and the government basically said, "Please don't do that." But the average American didn't know that. The other thing that I learned that I thought was really interesting in regards to the Florida operation was that Bobby Kennedy, who was then the Attorney General, was essentially commissioned by his brother, the president, to keep an eye, to oversee this whole operation, because the Kennedys were really intent on getting rid of Castro. As much as Eisenhower had authorized this assassination attempt on Castro, the Kennedys were particularly keen on getting rid of Castro for a number of different reasons. But so the idea that the Attorney General of the United States, Bobby Kennedy, was directly involved in overseeing this attempts to get rid of Castro, get rid of a foreign leader, is really extraordinary. And I think a lot of the histories about Kennedy give it short shrift. I don't think they quite realize that. So, and I think some of these documents that were recently made public, they also give a little bit more idea of just how much Kennedy was involved. He was particularly all over the CIA agent, a guy named Bill Harvey, who was known as the James Bond of the CIA. But and he was a very effective spy, Bill Harvey. But he was in charge of Johnny Roselli and also what was going on in Florida. And Bobby Kennedy was all over him, saying, when are we going to get Castro? Come on, let's go. And he was pretty critical of Harvey and that he wasn't doing enough. And what's the problem? And of course, that was compounded by the fact that Castro somehow kept on evading the attempts to get rid of him. Somehow magically was able to do this and to avoid assassination. And it's interesting. It wasn't until the 1980s that the CIA really fully got an idea of just how many informants Castro had been able to put into Florida. There was I believe it was a Cuban diplomat who flipped, who fled, and he went to an embassy in Europe. I forget exactly the details. The details are in my book, but what happens is he provides all this information about what was going on with informants of Castro's in the Florida area. And as they checked it out, it all checked out. And they just realized how many informants and just how Castro, with the training of the Russians, was able to develop his own spy network in a relatively short period of time, not only in Cuba, but in Florida. And that was one of the major reasons why he was able to avoid assassination. Yeah,
I was going to say, because you mentioned the constant missed assassination attempts of Castro were like a game of whack-a-mole. And he was just able to evade, I think it was 8 official assassination attempts, but some people say there may have been over 500 or something, some crazy number that he was able to avoid. And at the time, the U.S. government is helping to overthrow entire governments. Like they're organizing coups in Iran, Guatemala, Nicaragua, like all these places on the other side of the globe. The U.S. is successfully, well, depending on your definition of success, but they are overturning entire governments. And then Castro is this one guy 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and it's like he's just a slippery duck. Like they can't do anything. They're like completely helpless when it comes to getting close to him.
Yeah, and it's hard for us to say we're the good guys when we're trying to kill foreign leaders
Yeah.
and such, and certainly that's a problem. The flip side of it is, though, if you can kill Osama bin Laden, which was something that came up before 9/11, and had been able to get rid of Osama bin Laden, would that have perhaps prevented the 9/11 catastrophe that happened in this country? And so to what extent should foreign assassination be part of our foreign policy? That generally for the last 50, 60 years has been an unacceptable prospect. We've said, no, we're not going to get involved in that, starting particularly with President Ford in the 1970s. As all of the stuff in Mafia Spies became more and more well known, he put a prohibition on political assassinations. But the use of drones definitely raises the whole question, isn't that really an assassination? And to what extent should we be involved in that? And I think a lot of people would say it's appropriate. And I think in some cases, perhaps it is. But I think there's not much debate about it. And it's becoming more and more blurry as we see somebody like Putin clearly assassinating people. And also as we see the Supreme Court opening the door with presidential immunity. So no matter what you do in an official capacity, you could somehow be protected from any possible criminal violations. That was always the big concern here in Mafia Spies. They're always worried that if this comes out, oh my God, we're going to get in big trouble. The intermediary between the CIA and the mob is a guy named Robert Maier, who's really a slippery character and a really interesting character in my book, Mafia Spies. But he said he definitely debated about whether or not I could really get in trouble if this all comes out. And he debated about whether or not he should get involved in it at all, whether or not it was moral, or so he said. He did get involved in it, and I don't know how moral Bob Maier really was, but this is something that he said. It's a very interesting question that this story raises, and it's very much with us today.
Yeah. Going back to Castro's intelligence capabilities, do we have any information on the specifics of the mechanisms that he was using to collect information, or the way that the Cuban intelligence was organized? I know you mentioned there was testimony of a couple people who flipped, but do we know anything about the specifics of Castro's intelligence collection and how he was able to become so competent so quickly?
Well, we often will rely on gadgets and things of that nature, but fundamentally spying has always been had a human touch to it, that it's developing sources, it's developing informants and such. So these documents that came out, I know, for instance, there was one particular document that I saw where they were wondering, how is it that all of these attempts to kill Castro are failing, and what about? And they started to have doubts about a lot. The CIA started to have doubts about a number of people who were in the United States who they were dealing with. Certainly, Bill Harvey had doubts about that. Probably the best example of Castro's involvement and his spy network surrounds the character of Santo Trafficante. Santo Trafficante was part of the attempts to kill Castro as all of this comes out, but was Santo Trafficante, who was the head of the mob in Tampa. He was also involved in Miami, but he was a Spanish-speaking gangster, second-generation gangster. But he was also very much involved in the drug trade. And when you're involved in the drug trade, getting drugs into the United States through the Caribbean, you definitely want to have Castro's cooperation. So throughout my book, Santo Trafficante is a really fascinating character. And we ultimately are asking ourselves, I think the reader asks, was he always a double agent? And to what extent did Santo Trafficante, who acted like the friend of Gianni Roselli and Sam Giancana, was he somehow responsible or involved in their murders as well? So he's just one of the many examples of this kind of shady double nature aspect of a number of figures involved in the story, and whether or not they were spies for Castro as well.
Yeah, Trafficante seems like the most complicated character in Mafia Spies, and he met Roselli because you mentioned he was out of Tampa, but he met Roselli and Giancana at the San Sushi Casino
right.
in Havana.
Right. Yeah, it was on the outskirts of Havana.
Yeah, and Trafficante, he was working at the San Sushi, or he was the head of San Sushi, because I know Roselli and Giancana also had interests in the Havana casinos. That was part of the whole reason why the mob in the U.S. was pissed at Castro for shutting down those private interests. But that was how they first linked up, right, at the San Sushi.
Yeah, absolutely. You own the place in Havana, but you're from Chicago or you're from Los Angeles, and as Johnny and Sam Giancana were. So, and they don't speak Spanish. So you really need somebody. And Trafficante was part of the upper levels of the mafia. He worked a lot with Maier who was the renowned gangster in Miami. And so the fact that Trafficante spoke Spanish, he was also he wasn't a brash gangster, quite the contrary. He looked like he was the bookkeeper. Sometimes he would wear a bow tie, and he would wear glasses, and he looked like the accountant rather than the enforcer at these places. But he was very smart, very shifty, and he was able to keep an eye on things. He spoke Spanish, so he knew, if they were worried about being if money was going out the door in a way that the mob didn't want to see, it was Trafficante that they relied upon, and they were friends. Johnny considered Trafficante a real friend, in particular. But what happened was Trafficante ultimately, betraying them in their sense. I think there's a lot to be. When you look at the record, it looks as if Trafficante was playing both sides against the middle.
Yeah, because one of the questions that doesn't really get answered in the notes of history, and you mentioned this in the book, it's not really clear what happened. Is Trafficante? It was during Castro's takeover of Cuba, right, where he got detained in Cuban prison, and then he was set to be killed up by a firing squad, shot up against the wall, and then Trafficante even calls his attorney and says, "I'm going to be shot. They're going to execute me. I'm on the list." And then all of a sudden, he's released from Cuban prison. What do you believe is behind Trafficante's sudden release, like the nature of his relationship with the Cubans and the Castros?
That attorney of Trafficante was a guy named Frank Ragano, and he later wrote a book about his experiences. I think there was a certain amount of money that was given to the Castro government to get Trafficante out, a large sum of money, American money, to get him to get him out, but also it was just very odd. And particularly people like Bill Harvey and the CIA, they said, well, wait a minute. How was it that everybody else, all these other gangsters, all these other businessmen, they put him up against the wall and fired away. And here was Trafficante in a Cuban jail. How did he wind up getting out? How was this possible? And what type of promises were there made? And so that was always something that lingered in the whole debate about Trafficante and whether or not he was a double agent or not.
If you had to guess, do you think there was some sort of deal made with the Castros and Trafficante when when Trafficante was locked up, and then Fidel said, "You're going to play both sides now, or we're going to kill you"? And Trafficante was like, "All right, sure, I'll inform the Cubans while I'm working with the CIA."
Yeah, I think Trafficante did what was best for Trafficante. And so he was able to get out of the jail. He was one of these people that was helping Johnny and Giancana in the attempts to kill Castro, and yet the people that he recommended, that he knew that could be assassins, or to be more precise, who would put poison into Castro's milkshake or things like that, somehow after a few months, it didn't work out just the way Trafficante had said it might happen. And so, he did a lot of fake outs and promises that never came to be. And there were so many other failures that it didn't seem that odd. But later on, Trafficante is even more complicated, because when this stuff becomes when it becomes known in the mid 1970s, in other words, the plot from 1960s, the early 60s to kill Castro, when that becomes public in hearings in the Senate, and Johnny Roselli and Sam Giancana are subpoenaed to testify in the Senate, and so is Trafficante. Magically, both Trafficante and Johnny Roselli wind up dead. And I think...
You mean Giancana and Roselli wind up dead?
Yeah, excuse me if I misspoke. Yes, Sam Giancana and Roselli wind up dead. And magically, Trafficante is the last man standing in all of this. And I think when you look at... certainly when I am doing the research about this, when I look at both the deaths of Sam and Johnny, there seems to be Trafficante's fingerprints on both those deaths.
Yes, because Sam, it seems like he's the type of guy. Giancana seems like he was going to be the more likely one to blabber in the testimony and just get everything all out there and not hesitate to make a connection to Trafficante. But then Roselli, when he actually testifies, I think he mentions Trafficante's name, but is kind of like sly about the details, doesn't really implicate Trafficante in any meaningful way. But even with Roselli mentioning Trafficante's name, he hated any type of publicity, and that whole situation with the link to Trafficante from Giancana's murder, and Giancana he was supposed to talk to members to testify. It was like the day after Giancana got killed, or the day after he was supposed to testify, but he ended up being killed. And there's a possible link to Trafficante with Giancana's murder.
Well, with Trafficante, it's interesting because when Giancana he's subpoenaed to testify before the Senate. And so as is often the case, they'll send investigators out to kind of prep Giancana in advance of his testimony. So 2 investigators flew out to Chicago, and that same night, Giancana had one of his daughters and some friends over for dinner. They went home, and Giancana had kind of like this man cave in his home, and he made a late night snack for himself. It was sausages and some peppers that he was preparing. And through the back door, somebody came in, whether or not it was a friend or whatever. But in any event, the person had a gun with a silencer and shot Giancana first in the back of the head and then in the mouth. And it was kind of a telltale thing where when you shoot somebody like that in the mouth, it's a warning signal to anybody else who might think of talking, that they better keep their mouth shut, and or else something like this will happen to you. And that gun, what happened was the person who killed Giancana fled in a car. There were 2 housekeepers who lived in another part of the home. Apparently, they called the cops. The cops were on their way. You could apparently hear the siren or whatever. But whoever killed Giancana took the gun and about a mile away from his house, flung it out the window. And that gun was eventually recovered by the cops and attached. They found the silencer on the gun. And when they traced the gun, the gun actually went back to a gun shop in Tampa, Florida. It wasn't a gun in Chicago. It was a gun that was traceable to Tampa, Florida, the home base of Trafficante. So that to some extent was kind of my indication, an indication to me at least, that somehow Trafficante was involved. Well, Trafficante was even more involved with Gianni Roselli shortly thereafter, a few months after the Giancana killing. Gianni Roselli was also asked to testify, and his situation was even more complicated, Gianni Roselli's, because Roselli had spent his whole life with a phony alias. He had actually, as a young boy, come from Italy with his mother and siblings, and his real name was Filippo Sacco. And the FBI, who was running after both Sam and Giancana and Gianni Roselli, in pursuing Roselli in particular, they learned his real name, Filippo Sacco. It's a long story. It's in my book, but it's really an interesting story, just how they learn his real name. But they confront Johnny, and they realize that Johnny now realizes, because he's been convicted of a crime, he was involved in this kind of phony card scam at the Friars Club out in Beverly Hills. He had served some time. This is in between the 1960 and 1975. Johnny realized that he could be deported, and that he was here illegally, and that he had this phony name, Gianni Roselli. Everybody knew him as Gianni Roselli. It was a phony name. And so he was very concerned that he would be tossed out of the country, because they would do that to gangsters. That was one of the ways that they would deport gangsters if they could find. That was one of the ways to get rid of them. And so Johnny was particularly a worrisome thing for the mob, because they thought he might flip and tell even more. And actually, Johnny, to avoid getting deported, what he hinted through his lawyer was that he knew something about the JFK assassination. And in the mid-'70s, that's when it really started to come out, all these concerns about JFK's assassination. Could there have been a conspiracy? Was the mob involved? Was Cuba involved? A lot of people started asking the questions that the Warren Commission probably should have considered back in 1964. So the idea that Johnny would kind of dangle, that was the word, dangle this information that he maybe knew something about JFK. They subpoenaed him, and before he could testify in that regard, he winds up dead. In fact, Johnny kind of knew that he had a target on his back by that point. And a few weeks before he gets killed, he appeals to Santo Trafficante. He goes out to dinner with Johnny's sister, Trafficante's wife. They go out together, and yet that doesn't seem to have any. It doesn't seem to have any effect on Johnny's fate. And a few weeks later, he winds up dead, chopped up in a barrel that's thrown in the waters not too far from the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami, which is the place where they all first began this whole attempts to kill Castro.
That just goes to show how cold-blooded Trafficante is, that, you know, he could have dinner with someone and just completely put aside those emotions and talk to someone like they're friends and just kind of like shoot the shit. And then 3 weeks later, possibly murder them and chop them up in a barrel and not think twice about it.
Well, you know, in Mafia Spies, our TV show on Paramount and Showtime, there's 3 clips from The Godfather. But when we're talking about there's a scene in The Godfather where the actor Abe Vigoda, who he's exposed as a double agent against the Godfather, and he goes to Tom Hagen, the attorney, played by Robert Duvall. And he says something, "Hey, Tom, can you get me off the hook?" And he says, "Sorry, Sally, no can do," or something to that effect. And that's kind of like the same emotion that actually happened in real life here between Trafficante and Gianni Roselli. Johnny couldn't get off the hook and winds up dead.
How much do you believe the Kennedys, John F. Kennedy and his brother Bobby, the Attorney General, how much do you believe that the Kennedys knew about the Mafia's and the CIA's plan to kill Castro?
Well, I know that Robert Kennedy said to colleagues of his that he did not know about any attempts, because there was a piece that appeared in 1967 in a Jack Anderson column that talked about the attempts to kill Castro, and Bobby Kennedy claimed that he didn't know it. I doubt that, though. I think that Bobby Kennedy didn't want any of this to come out. That's one of the reasons why Allen Dulles was put at his suggestion on the Warren Commission. And I think that was something that Bobby Kennedy really didn't want to see come out. And of course, the CIA didn't want it to come out. This was a terribly secretive plot to kill a foreign leader. So we didn't want this. Officialdom did not want this to come out. But I think it's really interesting to see just how much did the Kennedys know. There are two CIA agents who directly, I mentioned Bill Harvey and a person that worked with Bill Harvey, who later testified that from the outset, JFK wanted a mechanism to get rid of foreign leaders like Castro. And they actually testified. And that's in the documents that came, Bill Harvey's testimony that came out 5 years ago, and some of the documents and such. So it's really interesting to see. JFK was a very smart man. He was a man who had witnessed World War II right up. He had a front row to it. He was there with Winston Churchill, giving speeches in London when London was being bombed. His brother, his oldest brother, had lost his life fighting against Hitler. So the idea that maybe we would have another Hitler type of situation, or a person that was willing to put nuclear weapons 90 miles from the United States, and the fact that Castro was willing to do that, there was no doubt I think in Kennedy's mind that we had to get rid of Castro. He did say that we, in so many words, that we had to get rid of a new regime there. And so did Bobby Kennedy know specifically all the details about the assassination attempts on Castro? It's not clear, not definitive there. But when you look at how much he was involved down there and overseeing the CIA operation, it's hard to believe that he didn't have some idea about it.
Yeah, absolutely. When you mentioned combing through the JFK files that have dropped in the past 5 years, thousands of files that have come out. What would you say is your biggest holy shit moment looking at a document, coming across a transcript? Is there anything that sticks out in your mind of, I can't believe this is not being reported on. I can't believe no one has, made this public yet, or like in the mainstream media, like something that you discovered where you just went, holy shit.
Well, the documents that came out 5 years ago, they really provide a lot more detail about the CIA's operation running out of Florida. And just having been to Miami on a number of occasions, the idea of running a war out of an undeclared war, and that most Americans were unaware of it, and just the extent of what was going on, and all of the phony buildings and the front buildings, and all the effort that was being made to get rid of Castro, that was being launched from Florida. That was probably the biggest holy shit moment. And also the idea that Bobby Kennedy was much more involved in it than I knew. And I had written 2 books about the Kennedys. The previous books I wrote about the Kennedys, one had to do with how their Irish Catholic immigrant experience, the family's experience, informed their private and public lives. And so I wasn't really all that aware that much of what was going on in Cuba. And also the other book that I did was about the Churchills and the Kennedys. So much of that was about World War II. But as I go through these documents and I realize the Attorney General of the United States is overseeing this whole operation to overthrow a government, run out of Florida, that to me was the biggest holy shit moment. And I think it's really been given short shrift in the histories of that time period.
So when JFK is assassinated, the Warren Commission gets put together to investigate the assassination of JFK. Alan Dulles, the head of the CIA, was put on the commission by Lyndon Johnson. And I think you argue in the book that Lyndon Johnson probably did this in good faith. Like, he thought it would be a good idea to have Dulles on the commission. Yeah. But Dulles never mentions the CIA plot to kill Castro to the Warren Commission. He's the head of the CIA, obviously knew what was going on. And in the Family Jewels document, I think it gets, it's pretty clear cut that Alan Dulles knew everything that was going on. What do you make of the findings of the Warren Commission, knowing the fact that the guy who was the head of the CIA did nothing to help the commission, get to the true findings and actively dissuaded them from looking into certain things?
Well, a couple things. First, I think there's no doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin of JFK. But when you do a murder investigation, you have to do it open-eyed, and you have to look at all of the possibilities. And so if you're not, if one of the possibilities is that a guy who said, in essence, you're trying to kill me, two can play that game, which is what Castro said just before this, that they didn't really, that the Warren Commission did not thoroughly examine that aspect of it, is something that was very, very unfortunate. I think the members, somebody like Earl Warren, I think was given this task by the President of the United States, and somewhat reluctantly. It was a very big task for the head of the Supreme Court to do this, to be involved in this murder investigation. That's an extraordinary request by the President of the United States. But it was an extraordinary time. It was horrendous what had happened to President Kennedy, and the nation was in mourning. So I think most of the members of the Warren Commission pursued this in good faith. They did as best a job as they could. But I think in the case of Dulles, he clearly was involved in this case. In fact, years later, maybe 2 years after the Warren Commission came out, there was an NBC documentary. You could find it on YouTube, where they interviewed Alan Dulles. It was an NBC documentary called, I think, The Science of Spying. And Alan Dulles on TV, nationwide television, says, well, the Soviets may use assassination, but I can't think of anything where we would do such a thing. And that's extraordinary, because the records are replete with Dulles' involvement in this case. The CIA did not formally acknowledge this until 2007. They released a document called the Family Jewels document, in which a lot of the top secret things that were being done like this were revealed by the CIA. And so that's more than 50 years after the occurrence. The CIA finally acknowledges that they had hired these two gangsters, Gianni Roselli and Sam Giancana, to kill Castro. But when we look at what are we to make of the whole thing with the Warren Commission, I think they did the best job possible. Unfortunately, one of the members of the commission was clearly deliberately keeping very important information from them, even them. And so I think when we look back on it, we just say, could there have been some involvement either by the mob and or by the Cubans or the Cuban exiles in Florida against Kennedy? To some extent, we'll never know.
Yeah, it sounds like the Warren Commission is like the crew on the Titanic, and they have no idea about the iceberg in front of them. And then Alan Dulles is also on the Titanic, and he has this bombshell of information, and he could say, just shift the nose of the boat a few degrees, just shift it like 4 to 5 degrees. And, maybe you want to look in this direction, but he kind of just stays silent, and then the boat just crashes into the iceberg. Like, he has just like such electrifying, game-changing information. And he has a lot of reasons not to share it, but the fact that he chose not to share it, I mean, I can't see a world in where that doesn't alter the outcome of the Warren Commission.
In my book, I towards the end of the book, I mentioned that Gerald Ford said publicly that he regretted the fact that they didn't know about this CIA plot, and that clearly it should have been part of the deliberations by the Warren Commission about whether or not there could have been some type of influence or some involvement of the CIA plot against Castro. There are people who say the CIA was involved with Kennedy's assassination. I think that's not true, but I do think minimally, if you're doing a murder investigation, you want to know all the possible suspects and identify them. And the fact that Castro had made this claim, and that somehow the mafia clearly was upset with Kennedy as well, was that fully explored? Unfortunately, it looks like it wasn't.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of dark reasons why Dulles did not share that information with the Warren Commission. But I was thinking, because you write about how Dulles was such a huge fan of James Bond, and he would literally go up to agents and say, I read about this in the last Ian Fleming book, this shoe knife or this poison dart pen. Do we have this yet? And they'd be like, no, like you just read that in a book. Like, obviously we don't have it yet. Do you think it's possible that Dulles was embarrassed by the failure of the Castro plot, like not just hiding it to hide the information and to not take responsibility, but like felt shame because he was such a big spy fan, like a James Bond fanboy? It seems like he saw himself as like a big hitter in the spy community, but he can't assassinate one guy a boat ride away from U.S. soil.
Well, let's talk about Alan Dulles for a moment. Alan Dulles was the head of the CIA during the Eisenhower period. And around 1958, he went to Florida to see Joe Kennedy, who was the father of JFK. He was the multimillionaire, really the money bags behind the whole Kennedy campaign. And Alan Dulles essentially went to Joe Kennedy to try to keep his job. He tried to lobby for himself to maintain the job. And in fact, the father recommended that Jack Kennedy keep Alan Dulles. And that's what he did when Jack Kennedy became president of the United States. He kept Alan Dulles in place. But along with Alan Dulles came a plan to invade Cuba that had been devised during the later stages of the Eisenhower administration. And it was a plan to have the Cuban exiles that were being trained invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. And it turned out to be a big disaster, partly because Castro knew that they were coming, so he was all prepared. But even more so, I think they thought, the CIA thought, that even though Kennedy said, I will not commit air power to this, you can do this, but I'm not going to have our jets flying over and getting involved in this, because this will create World War III. And so when this all happens and they invade, Kennedy remains steadfast on his promise that they would not provide air cover. So the Bay of Pigs becomes a big disaster, and Alan Dulles is blamed for it. In fact, Kennedy rues the fact this only happened about 3 months into Kennedy's tenure as the president. So he feels that this has been a big disaster on his watch. Kennedy takes the blame for it, even though he was sold this plan, and it was a faulty plan, and they really intended to force his hand with the air power. And so Kennedy was so angry about it that he eventually winds up firing Alan Dulles. So it's really interesting that he fires Dulles, and so Dulles is gone within a year of that invasion. So the following year, in 1963, when Kennedy is assassinated, it's really odd that it's Bobby Kennedy who's recommending that Allen Dulles, the man who his brother fired, that Allen Dulles be put on that Warren Commission.
Yeah.
So I found that really, really interesting. The lawyer for Bobby Kennedy, who suggested to President Johnson that he put Allen Dulles on the Warren Commission, that lawyer later said he was unaware about this plot as well. So, it's really interesting to see not only the role of Allen Dulles, but even more so, in a way, Bobby Kennedy. Why would he put somebody like Allen Dulles, who had been fired by his brother, on the panel to review the assassination of JFK? Very odd, and I think part of it had to do with the concern about this Mafia Spies plot, the CIA plot to kill Castro, and whether or not it would become public or not.
Yeah. I wanted to read an excerpt that you included in the book from journalist Drew Pearson. And Drew Pearson was a columnist, voted the America's most popular columnist by a Time magazine poll. And he published this excerpt as part of a bigger article in the aftermath of the JFK assassination in 1967. And Drew Pearson writes, quote, "President Lyndon Johnson is sitting on a political H-bomb, an unconfirmed report that Senator Robert Kennedy may have approved an assassination plot, which then possibly backfired against his brother." What are your thoughts on the JFK assassination being a Castro counterplot to retaliate against the CIA for trying to kill him?
Well, it's hard for anybody like myself to credibly say anything definitively that regard. In other words, was Castro went to his grave claiming that he had nothing to do with it? Were people who were upset with Kennedy because of what happened with the Bay of Pigs, were they possibly involved with Lee Harvey Oswald? Who knows? It's not really clear. And my feeling is that when you do a murder investigation, as an investigative reporter myself for my whole career, one year I did a whole investigation about murders, and I talked to a lot of murder experts. One of the things that they impressed upon me, this had nothing to do with what we're talking about here, but just in general about a murder investigation, within the first 72 hours, if you don't find the likely suspect, you're going to have a much more difficult time period in any type of murder investigation. And in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, they did find, they arrested Oswald, and it was so screwed up, the fact that somehow Ruby was able to kill, be able to shoot and kill Oswald, the leading suspect in this. Perhaps the only suspect, but they didn't know. It's just so odd, and so there's no doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald was involved with the assassination of JFK. But to speculate beyond that is something that even people who have written definitively that Oswald was the lone assassin have also acknowledged, like Gerald Posner, who wrote the book Case Closed, that this whole aspect of the Castro assassination attempt was not really properly examined by the Warren Commission. And he says that, he makes that pretty clear in Mafia Spies, the TV show. We have a number of experts who say that. It's not just my my statements. In fact, like I said, I think I'm pretty cautious in going beyond. When people ask me, who do you think killed JFK? I say it's Lee Harvey Oswald. And then the things that I raise in Mafia Spies are just things that should have been examined, but we can't say for sure if anybody else was involved in the conspiracy with JFK's death.
Let's say in 20 years, it does come out that JFK was killed as a direct retaliation for the CIA's plot to kill Castro. What would you say is the absolute best piece of evidence that exists today that would support that theory if it was proven true in the future?
Well, if Oswald said, "I'm a patsy," that's on tape. I mean, that was filmed just before he was murdered, and in the history of murders, how many suspects say something to the effect that I was a patsy? Usually they say, "Oh, I didn't do it," or they actually admitted, "I killed her, I killed him." They did it in a fit of rage. But how many people in the history of murder say, "I was a patsy"? So if Oswald had any involvement with people, either through the mob or through any other aspects of this story that I detail in Mafia Spies, I wouldn't be surprised. But right now, I think it's really important that we don't delve into constant conspiracies, because I think really the genie was unleashed in the 1970s. And I think in this time of fake news and public officials who should be trusted to tell the truth, tell just the opposite, who are familiar with lying in public, and there's no consequences for that, or seemingly no consequences, where the public can be confused as if they're a bunch of suckers. I think it's really important for us not to delve into conspiracies unless we have hard proof. And so that's why as you mentioned, I have about a third of my book is footnotes. And as an investigative reporter, I like to have a receipt for everything that I say. And so those receipts can be found at the back of my book. And also the TV show, Mafia Spies, on Paramount and on Showtime, we have a number of different people on the record talking about this. So I think people get a real good sense from the show, and even more so from the book with all the detail of just what an extraordinary time in American history this was.
I wanted to read one more fascinating excerpt to get some clarification on this context. And this is Lyndon Johnson on the Castro connection to JFK's assassination. And you write that since that dark day in Dallas, Lyndon Johnson had harbored many doubts about JFK's 1963 killing. This CIA mafia scheme to kill Castro and the alleged, quote, blowback retribution it provoked seemed as plausible as any theory. Quote, "I'll tell you something about John Kennedy's murder that will rock you," Johnson said to ABC television anchor Howard K. Smith in October 1968. Kennedy was trying to kill Castro, but Castro got him first. Smith pleaded for more details from Johnson, but the president begged off. "It will all come out one day," he assured. Johnson offered a similar version to CBS newsman Walter Cronkite. Both comments were not broadcast at that time. So was Lyndon Johnson saying this on air and they chose not to broadcast it? Or like what? Because right. like wild for a president to say on a recorded broadcast. Like what was the context behind that situation?
Yeah, when you're exactly whether or not it was filmed or not, sometimes when you do a TV interview, people will be hooking you up with a microphone and they'll be setting the lights. And there's chit chat between the interviewer and the interviewee. And I gather that's what happened. So far, I haven't seen any tape like that of Johnson saying, so he apparently said it off camera or when the cameras were not rolling. But it's extraordinary. I mean, these were two anchormen of ABC and CBS at a time in our national life when anchormen were the pillars of truth and such, Walter Cronkite in particular, I don't think was inclined to bury the truth, but he was, somebody who had come of age in World War II, and there were times in which people said, "Please don't report this." They would tell reporters things off the record or on background and such, but that they don't want to be on the record saying that. It's an extraordinary statement what President Johnson said.
Yeah.
And so, there's something later on I quote in my book where he has a conversation with another senator who's a confidant of Johnson's, and he basically says the same thing and says this is amazing. So I just think it begs the question about that historians now should look back on this and hopefully get all of the documents. There's still some documents that are kept confidential. Not everything has been released, and I think it's about time that all of those records be released, not just even the batch. And there were quite a few released 5 years ago, but there's still several hundred, if not 1,000, records that are still confidential and have not been released.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine trying to do a broadcast after that. If, the president's just getting his mic ready and he leans over to you and says, by the way, I think Castro killed Kennedy. And it's like, all right, we're live. Let's go. And then just like right, off the record, right. I'd just be sitting there like, what the fuck did you just like?
The press, this is interesting about the press too, because Watergate, and I lived through this period as a young man, with Watergate, it did change the attitude of the press. During World War II, we were all fighting against Hitler. And so the press was open-eyed to some extent, but we were all on the same side. And the press reported things that way. And between Vietnam, where the government was saying one thing and what was going on in the ground in Vietnam was something different. The press slowly matured, and particularly with Watergate, the press became more of an appropriate oversight, a watchdog of government rather than a lapdog of government. And so I think when these comments were made by President Johnson in the late 60s, I'm sure Johnson, who kind of blurted out things to some extent the way that Trump will every so often blurt out things. Trump blurts out a lot of things. Yeah. But Johnson said this, and I think Johnson was really amazed. I don't think what my book shows is that Johnson was not made aware of this Mafia Spies plot until about 3 years into his presidency. It was extraordinary stuff. And it's extraordinary that there's an agency like the CIA that felt empowered to keep something like this from the President of the United States. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from reading Mafia Spies. The show is terrific. I think they really capture a lot of what happened. It really makes it come to life. And a lot of the detail and a lot of some of the subplots as well that don't make it into the TV show are explained in detail in my book.
Yeah. So if you could go back in time to the 60s and attach yourself to one figure from Mafia Spies, which is you have total access to hear and see everything that they do, who would you pick?
Oh, without a doubt, Johnny Roselli. Roselli is an absolutely fascinating guy. He's in the world of Hollywood. He's in the world of Las Vegas, the beginning decade or two of Las Vegas. He's in the company of people like Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack. In fact, Johnny Roselli is sponsored by Frank Sinatra to get into the Friars Club in Beverly Hills. And Johnny turns out to fleece everybody in the Friars Club who were involved in this crooked card game. But he's a really interesting character. One of the things that I also liked about Johnny Roselli, as I mentioned, he changed his name. He used an alias, Johnny Roselli. Well, where did he get that name from? It wasn't John Doe or Jimmy Stewart or something like, some all-American name that he came up, John Wayne, which is John Wayne's pseudonym, his stage name. Johnny Roselli came up with the name Roselli. It was from a Vatican painter who had painted at the Sistine Chapel. Cosimo Roselli was his name, and he took that name and adopted it as his own. I mean, he was a really fascinating guy. He was also a guy who gave monies to Catholic charities. He grew up in that whole Catholic milieu. And as somebody who grew up Catholic, I'm really interested by, he was aware of certain things, and how at the end, when he knows he's a marked man, how he kind of tries to atone for his sins and such, but also is involved with the CIA down in Florida, his acts of valor by jumping in boats and trying to be a part of the attempts to overthrow the Cuban government. Fascinating character, absolutely fascinating. And the aspect of being handsome Johnny, of course, and the way he courted and seduced so many beautiful women in Hollywood, needless to say, is an interesting story in and of itself.
Yeah, and obviously he's a mafia guy through and through, but there were a couple humanizing moments in the book with Gianni Roselli. You mentioned going to confession at the end of the book when he's trying to atone for his sins. He goes to confession for the first time in his life. There's that moment where Judy Campbell is in a love triangle between JFK and Sam Giancana, and then JFK gets shot, and then Judy Campbell holds herself up in her room for days, just drinking, getting fucked up. He can't, Roselli can't reach her on the phone, so he shows up and sees Judy Campbell in pieces and sort of realizes that, he put her in a messed up situation with the whole honeypot thing. And you could tell that he genuinely feels bad and cares about her. So I think Gianni Roselli is a great choice for attaching yourself to a character from Mafia Spies. And his character also makes me, it seems like the government had zero respect for the way that they asked these guys in the mob to help assassinate the leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro, and then the government leaves them out to dry. No surprise in the end. But it seemed like Roselli was, obviously he's done messed up shit. He's in the mob, but he also had a soft spot. He was a huge patriot, and he literally hopped on a speedboat to try to take out Castro in the middle of the night. Just like, he seems like a real just go for it, badass, fuck it guy. I'm going to take the risk and do what I need to do with my country. And then in the end, he gets no help.
Yeah. He also had a business card, and on the business card it said strategist. There were so many aspects of Gianni Roselli that were a lot of fun to report on and write on, and he, like I said, this is a documentary on Paramount and Showtime, but it would be also a great drama. It'd be a great movie. These two outlaw friends, and particularly Gianni Roselli, just an extraordinary story. So, in many ways, in doing the book, a lot of this stuff had been out there in a lot of histories and such. I like to think that the biggest achievement about Mafia Spies was by the fact that I used these two gangsters as the window into pulling together all these other different factors. What was going on in Las Vegas, what was going on in the mob. The biggest mob outfit was the Chicago mob outfit, but even bigger. New York is 5 families, but it's one family, it's one outfit in Chicago. What was going on in Cuba and in Florida, and of course in Washington. There was tidbits from and things explored in a number of different histories and books, but by pulling it together through the prism of the window of these two gangsters, these two outlaw friends, it was to me kind of like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, that old movie that was famous many years ago, but kind of like these two outlaws who travel to Cuba, they travel to Florida, but they don't travel on horses. They travel on planes. And so that was always, to me, really intriguing.
Well, Thomas Maier, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. Where is the best place for people to check out Mafia Spies, the book, which I highly recommend, and then also the series, and also to keep up with your work on social media? Where should people check that out?
Great. Well, I appreciate that. The book can be found on Amazon or any online bookstores, or please order it from your local bookstore if you prefer. The TV show can be found on Paramount Plus, all 6 episodes. And as we speak right now, on Showtime, we're into, I think, the 4th episode. Showtime is showing it 1 episode every Monday night.
Wow.
Through July and August. And so you can catch it, of course, on Showtime on demand as well. You can also find it on Hulu, I know for a fact, and I think you can also find it on Apple TV and through Amazon TV. So it's out there, and I really highly recommend it. Just last week, the New York Times gave Mafia Spies a big rave, a terrific article. Check out the article in the New York Times about Mafia Spies. It's a big rave. We're really, really happy about that. And for any more detail, you can find on my website, Thomas Maier Books. It's ThomasMaierbooks at .com. And that's my website, and you can find all the details about this and other books that I'm working on.
Thomas Maier, thank you so much. This was an absolute blast.
Zach, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.